Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Police Foundation Friday exchange. See lots of people joining us as we're starting here. And we're delighted today to do our Friday exchange with Professor Betsy Stanko OBE, who I'm sure to most of you will need no real introduction. But Betsy has been a really important voice in public debate around policing in this country for very many years. She has been a criminologist. She has quite uniquely for criminologists worked within a major police force in the Metropolitan Police. She was head of evidence and insight at MOPAC, and most latterly has been co-leading Operation Soteria Bluestone, which is a major piece of work to improve the way in which the police investigate rape and serious sexual offences. So, but we're going to get into all of that and talk about all of that in the course of the next hour. So, thanks very much. Welcome, Betsy. It's great to see you.
Good afternoon.
And I should just say for people who are joining, if you want to ask Betsy a question, or if there's something that either of us say that you want to pick up on and make a comment about, then you can do that in the chat function is the easiest way to do that. So if you stick your question or comment in the chat, and I'll then pick out some of those which I can introduce into the conversation that we're about to have. So I'll also say we are recording this session, so please bear that in mind, and it will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards for those who aren't able to join us. But it's great that so many of you are able to join us, which is really pleasing. I should just say we decided to do these sessions because we thought part of our role as the Police Foundation is to try to provide a platform for debate and discussion about policing, and we thought, you know, this would be a good way of doing this once a month, to get people together on a Friday lunchtime to have a chat with someone who's got an interesting perspective, and Betsy is definitely one of those. So Betsy, just to kick us off, I guess with a bit of your sort of backstory, really, just to say, how did you get into the world of criminology and then into policing? So, I mean, if you could just say a bit about your sort of journey to getting interested in these issues.
Right. Well, just to say, as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in the United States and lived mostly growing up in the Midwest, but then moved to New York when I was 20, finishing up my undergraduate degree there. And I took a criminology course. I was a sociology major, and the class just, I don't know, something was lit in me. It was a time of certainly of a lot of turmoil in the U.S. I'd lived through, you know, the deaths of JFK, Martin Luther King, RFK, all of the kind of Vietnam War. It was the beginning of the feminist movement, and all of the kind of struggles around civil rights. So it was quite a volatile time. And there was something about studying crime that I just went, ooh, that's interesting. I could do something. And I had a really good professor who then invited me to join a research team. I was young. I had not even finished undergraduate, and I started full-time on a research project. And I guess the rest is history. I worked on a few research projects, one of which was the evaluation of the New York drug law, which was the first 3 strikes and you're out. I was, for all people might find this amusing, the statistician. But at the same time, I was also doing my PhD in New York, and began to actually, because I had access to anywhere I wanted to be in criminal justice. So I saw Rikers Island, the courthouses, the district attorneys, and I rode around with the police service in New York. Again, by then I was hooked, and I started to be an academic criminologist.
Great, fascinating. And the thing that I'm really interested in is what then, because you spent a lot of time when you came to the UK, you then spent a lot of time working within the Met, and what was the thought process or the set of events which led to that happening? I'm just really interested to know that.
Well, it's a thread that started in New York, and that is I was a young graduate student riding around in squad cars in New York. I realized I could do it. I found the work fascinating. I began in the way in which I read criminology texts. Much of what was being portrayed in my experience was not in the books. And it was only then that people like John Van Manen and those that began to do observations of policing um, that began to talk to me about, well, actually, this is what we're seeing, but it's not in any of these books. The books are theoretical. They act as if justice happens the way we think it should. And we all now know that that's absolutely not the case. But not a lot of us were saying that in then. I was also doing work. So in the time I spent in the US at Clark University, I worked alongside police officers. I started a refuge for battered women. Police officers were in my classes. I would pick up the phone to the chief, because it's a small town, saying, a woman's just been assaulted. There's a warrant out for his arrest. He's drinking in this bar. Can you go pick him up? So I was used to working with police. In many ways, I don't see a uniform, I see a face. Very different than other people. So when I came to the UK in 82, it was on a sabbatical. I was a refugee, just finishing up a sexual harassment case in the US. That's another story. And I felt like, I should be doing research and talking to police. There weren't a whole lot of academics who were doing that kind of work. And if they did, it was quite hostile and aggressive. So I just found a way. I mean, it's sort of, it's about networks, isn't it? So I did some work with victim support. The person I was working with had a relationship with victim support Islington. I did some work with Islington Police, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about, I was in the time from 1990 to 2003. I was doing lots of different kinds of work, not only with police, but with practitioners, with activists and government, certainly around violence against women. And that was where my expertise lie then.
Yeah. And how did you what are your reflections on I mean, we'll come along to talk about Soteria in a minute and what you've been doing more recently, but what are your reflections on that period, and in particular how the police engage with research and engage with evidence, and what you drew from that?
Well, my animal totem is a chameleon. So I did find ways of doing research within the police. The hardest thing is getting access to crime records and police data. And so this was the era before GDPR and data sharing agreements and all that kind of stuff. You needed to have some kind of a trusting relationship with the police. And so I think probably was during the violence research program that I was doing. And I met John Grieve. And John, at that point, was the head of the Race and Violent Crime Task Force in the Met. And he invited me in to start looking at their data. Then I received a small grant on hate crime research, and it was all using police data. And that's when I went, well, this stuff, all the work that I've been doing to talk about, what is going on in policing, it's all there in the record. And so, and because of the hate crime project, we basically worked out of what was called the bomb room, which was in the old Scotland Yard days, room 929. And anybody on the line who knows what that room is, it is the Copeland bombing room. So it is And then of course, I met so many officers who I've now known for my whole career, and who are many of whom are still retired now, but many of whom are senior officers in the Met.
Yeah. And do you think the way in which, do you think the way in which the police engage with researchers has changed over that time? I mean, going back to the sort of the 1990s and where we are now.
I think the answer is both yes and no. I think getting access to electronic recorded crime data is still very, very difficult. On Soteria, we had to do 98 data sharing agreements. It was a nightmare. So the data sharing stuff, and I understand why it exists, but it's difficult. And also, there's a lot of police forces that still don't want people, researchers inside, or they may wish to talk to them or be happy to be interviewed, but actually seeing the work. So I still, part of that excuse is resources. The other part of the excuse is security. I think there is still fragile trust.
Right.
But I also think that researchers who are based in universities are one thing, researchers who are practitioners is another thing. And what's interesting to me is, well, what is the purpose of that research? How do you change practice based on it? And particularly for officers who are also students, how do they change? How does their research and understanding actually change the way the police work? I'm less optimistic at the moment, because I haven't seen a massive change in the kind of evidence-based policing environment. And so that's a plea to anybody on the call who is a police practitioner to really think quite carefully about how you push practice change, and also how you push others to understand what the evidence says and what the implications are that for the way police work is really important. And it's that I took into Soteria. So kind of my experience of working inside the Met for 10 years as an employee, or over a decade as an employee, there's almost nothing about a corporate police force that surprises me. I've been through it all. And so I know policing very well. And I also know, I think, some of the structures and mechanisms to pull levers for change.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, I mean, let's talk about Soteria then, because obviously this has been a major piece of work. And could you actually could you tell us first of all, because this is a question that I've been asked, where the name comes from? Can you just tell us that, what it means? Where does that come from?
It had nothing to do with me. Thank you very much.
Right, okay.
So once again, it's a ministerial directive. Kit Malthouse, when he was policing minister, decided that the program was going to become Operation Soteria, because it's the name of some Greek goddess of justice or something. So that's where it came from. It was a ministerial thing. Kit, being a former member of the MPA and the London Assembly, Operation something it's the way police talk. Everything's an operation this or that. And the minister decided to have one of his operations himself. So that's where it came from.
That's where it came from. And
totally serendipitous. It didn't have,
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. That's useful to know. And how did it come about? So if you could just talk us through the sort of narrative of, where it came from and how it got off the ground.
Right. So after the London Rape Review was published, which is 2019, which used a methodology that I had set up in the Met and had done 7 times before, no change. So the 2019 report basically not only confirmed that the methodology showed that there was still serious problems with rape investigation in London, but the situation gotten worse. Now, Catherine Hull and I had already been working on a book for a number of years, and that we wanted to. We decided that we were going to sit down and write a 2-page brief about if you were going to change things, what would it be, and how would we go about doing that. And at that point, I had done 2 other projects with MOPAC, post-retirement, and we'd learned a lot about learning and development, in particular. So Lizzie Peters and Robin Merritt, who were still at MOPAC, and also really keen to do something about the situation. The government had announced a London rape review, a rape review in the country, and that was in 2019. And it was sort of like I was a pop-up doll, kept saying, here's 2 pages, we can do something. I think I know what to do. I have an idea.
Right.
And basically, it was a struggle to get someone to say, oh, well, even if they said that's interesting, it's like, well, it's just a 2-page brief. How are you going to do it? It's like, well, we need funding. You need funding to try to do something. So in July of 2020, I spoke to Chief Constable Sarah Crew and said, I believe you have had a discussion about this approach, but we need to do it. And so she said, fine, but we still need to find money to do it. And so in October of 2020, some money became available from the Police Innovation Fund. I wrote a grant based on the 2-pager, turned it into a proposal. It was funded. It's not that straightforward, but it was funded for a tune of about £250,000. And we began work in January of 21. Right. And I also think that so it began as a proof of concepts. Basically, we had full access to Avon and Somerset, and which was amazing. I made 5 phone calls and got 5 pillar leads, because the approach is that if you have improvement or excellence in 5 areas, and think about 5 different things, and we added a 6th because of the surge in understanding the impact of digitalization on sexual offending, and those pillars are evidence-based. They're also supported by global research, and to begin to set out a kind of both a problem identification, and also, because I twinned each of the academic leads with a practitioner on the inside, a pillar lead, that the solutions became evolved during the discussion and the reporting of these are the kinds of things we're finding. So that, just to let everybody know, the 6 pillars are a suspect-focused investigation, an understanding of repeat offending, procedural justice in the way that police officers interact with victims, learning development and well-being that supports the capability and confidence of officers doing the work, data and analytics that support an understanding of outcomes as well as diagnostics around performance, and digital forensic investigations. Right. And the kind of outcomes, the findings, were fairly deep and damning of the current state of the police service in terms of investigations. For example, the investigations mostly focused around victim credibility and never got off the starting block in terms of even thinking about or talking to suspects, many of whom, by the way, are identified because 95% of the cases in the country are rapes, sexual offending between people that know it's rape in particular, that people that know each other. So it's really it's a relationship-based crime, not the kind of bush lurking stranger that everybody keeps assuming. We found that there was a large proportion of repeatedly named suspects. This is what shocked the police service in the first a lot, is that 1 in 4 of the suspects had sexual offending in their histories, and 60% of them had offending histories. So why don't you talk? Why don't you talk to suspects? Just a question. We found that the relationship between victims and their supporting services and the police was broken. There's a lot of tension between third sector and the police, and we needed to find a way to bring that together in order to promote procedural justice for victims. Learning and development was appalling. There were many officers who had never ever received a course on sexual victimization, the CIDIP course. There were young investigators who were dealing with very complex cases and huge and high workloads with high stress of the officers. Data and analytics, much to my great sorrow, was woeful. Nobody could produce a problem profile. And again, this was 10 years of austerity. Many of the people who left the organization were analysts. You just can't run a corporation without good analytics, but that is often the way the police service is run. And particularly around what is the problem of rape in your jurisdiction? What kinds of sexual offending is happening? What is the range? Who are the victims? Who are the suspects? These are important questions to answer if you're going to appropriately respond to them, both in investigation and in prevention. And then finally, the digital forensics and understanding how to appropriately investigate digital devices, phones as well as computers, and the way in which over the past 10 years, digital links. I mean, who lives without a smartphone? I mean, some, but the phones have become both the method and mode of victimization as well as a good investigation tool. Not much competence there either. So those 6 pillars really, in the proof of concept, came out very strong. It also, when we enabled the pillar lead in force to work with the academic lead, the evidence base was strong, and also trying to seek the solutions. Now, not surprisingly, very early on, we found that some of the solutions were not just in force. So, of course, we then, in the College of Policing, the Home Office, a number of other agencies and bodies had to become involved in the conversation because there were some serious issues.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so that was a proof of concept.
Yeah.
So anyway, the proof of concept, but actually I think the acceleration of the work and the fact that it became a focus, sadly, in many ways, was accelerated by the death of Sarah Everard. And the kinds of challenges around the country to the bad behavior and sexual abuse that some officers themselves also committed. And so we were in the middle of a storm, and the rape review was also going to be published in June. There were conversations that began with the Home Office in January through June. And we found ourselves, that is the kind of Operation Soteria had a name. There was a small team. It was Lizzie, Robin, Katrin, and I, and the pillar leads that suddenly got swept up into Another thing, I was holding on desperately to the methodology. Originally, we wanted to do depth in 3 forces. We were, it went up to 4 because the Home Offices wanted it. And then very soon after, we suddenly found ourselves engaging with 14 more, which was the next year, in addition to not only doing the research, engaging with 5 forces continuously, doing deep dives and then maintaining relationships with those forces, the Pathfinder forces, producing the evidence base, and then on top of that, creating what is now called the National Model for the Investigation of Rape and Sexual Offenses, which now exists on the College of Policing website as authorized professional practice by the NPCC. So there's a whirlwind. I mean, there's many things to say in there, but that was like, that's the shortest version possible.
Yeah. No, I mean, no, that's absolutely a brilliant description of how it came about. And could you, I mean, in terms of, I'm interested in this. We've talked about this before, but you know, what are the things you would pull out of Operation Soteria, which are the sort of key elements of a sort of model of change in policing? So because this, you know, this seems to me to be a very innovative and unique program of work, which has brought together academics and police practitioners together over a sustained period of time, and has resulted in in authorized professional practice. So everybody should now be following these recommendations. And as someone who does research in policing and makes lots of recommendations, which, you know, a lot of which sort of go out into the ether and don't find their way into practice, I'm just interested in what you would say about Soteria as a sort of model of change. What are the things which were done differently here, which means, you know, it has had an impact?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. It would not and it will not have an impact unless the police adopt it as their own. That's the one big lesson. Second, the pillars are mechanisms to think about your corporate capability and the way in which a corporate entity as a police force supports its own staff to do the work properly. And that was the biggest indictment, is that this is a corporate problem. It's a policing PLC problem. It's also, if we look at and take our history seriously, that policing was never, ever, ever set up to do this. If you go back to 1829, you know, the kind of like the milestone date that everybody uses, and over there's lots of other evidence about whether that's the right date, but I'm not even going to go there. And this notion that the police are the people and the people are the police. Well, frankly, women were not part of that people. We couldn't vote. We didn't have any rights. We weren't part of the mechanisms of protection. Indeed, policing was set up as for public protection, but also the protection of the class and colonial order that existed at the time. Now, that legacy is really important because when they introduced women police officers, they introduced them to deal with women and children. Right. And that was only at the turn of the 20th century. And actually, WPCs were called WPCs till I think 1996. I've got the date somewhere, but so the thing is, women were not in, both in terms of the sites of policing, unless somebody got killed, and even sometimes, a lot of times, that wasn't important either. And domestic violence wasn't a problem, rape wasn't a problem, sexual violence, and the way in which rape itself and sexual violence itself has a history. So we can't exclude understanding that rape was a crime of property against the father, And all of the kind of feminist activist efforts over the years, particularly in the last 40 years, to make the law far closer to lived experience. I mean, you couldn't even rape your wife until 1990. So there, these kinds of things are all part of the legacies that policing has to deal with. So I think that the question is, what are the kinds of things that we do need to think about resourcing seriously? We need to think about if we are going to include the policing of relationship violence, regardless of the relationship, because those are the hard ones. Now we talk about knife crime as if it's not about relationships. We talk about, other kinds of violence as if it's not about relationships. Most violence is all about relationships. Certainly that violence that comes to the doors of the police service. I know most violence is unreported, but when it is reported, there is a presumption that in a democratic country, we have access to justice, and that access to justice starts with the police, and we need them competent and confident to do work which actually represents what people experience as crime and are able to investigate that in a way that enables the challenge of that in a court of law.
Yeah.
Simply, I mean, it's not so simple, because what we found out is the whole structure of the police service was on its knees in doing so. And we continue to hear that. We heard it today about the kinds of issues around policing sexual exploitation of young people. We need to get better, but we need to get better faster.
Yeah. And I just we got some questions coming, so I just wanted to bring in some of those. A question here from Dennis, who says, my experience tells me that real police reform will not occur until we change the metrics by which we evaluate the performance of individual officers. I would recommend contact surveys for all victims focused on procedural justice, with a system in place for regular analysis and feedback of results to the agency. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Dennis, guess what? Soteria has a survey of victims, which we suggest is part of a performance metric. So how people think about policing, how people feel about their contact with policing has been something I have been involved with for, in particular, in the last 25 years. And so if you take a look at what good looks like on the College of Policing website, then you'll see that we offer different metrics, and the metrics are as much about how to, not just to measure individual officers, because what we found in this project is the corporate structure of policing did not give individual officers the right information, learning and development, and support to do the job. Yeah. And I don't think that the problems of policing fall solely on the shoulders of individual officers. This is a corporate problem and a PLC, what I call policing PLC problem. And and that's one of the things we found. Again, 43 forces in England and Wales, 43 ways of doing things, 43 ways of deploying officers, of using resources differently in their forces. Very few of them supporting the competence and confidence of investigators in sexual offending.
Well, what you just said there, there's another question from Sarah, which is, does Betsy think the 43 force structure is a hindrance? And perhaps if I just build on that a little bit, so you've obviously had to, through Soteria, deliver something through all these 43 forces. I mean, do you think the 43 force structure needs to go, or do you think there are ways of working through it in more effective ways that can actually deliver change? I mean, what's your sort of general take on that?
Yeah, so we did not develop a cookie cutter model. The model is not one that says every force has to do this. You have to think and interpret. But I would flip it the other way. I would say, what kind of support do we have to policing across 43 forces that is a really good enabler, so that those forces who can draw upon expertise, knowledge, and ways of doing things that help them improve on a continuous basis. I think we need to go farther and stronger on that level, and I don't think we have the full support. Because we heard lots of complaints about the bodies who are supposed to be providing that support to the police service, and we're working very strongly with the College of Policing in terms of redesigning the kind of courses that we think the evidence base suggests is most appropriate. We found that there was no information about sexual offending behavior and sexual offenders in the learning and development in the investigation of rape and sexual offenses. Using Patrick Tidmarsh's work on the whole story in terms of the way you think about investigation, focusing on suspect behavior as opposed to, what did she do? What did the victim do? Is really, really important. And it also is the evidence base. Because it's got to be a way of thinking very differently about doing something if 97% of the time on the level of investigation, no charges are brought. I mean, what is going on in 97% of those cases? And those were the questions I was asking. What is it about the 97% that you don't understand? What's going on? And all of the evidence that we've got in this country and elsewhere is that so-called false allegations of rape are still small, between 3 and 6%. They're small. So what is it about the 90% that isn't working? And that's the way we went in, using these 6 pillars of inquiry. Can we learn something and actually we learned together. Those deep dives enabled us to have a really strong understanding of, at least we knew what the problem was. Then it's actually working. That's the complication. 43 different ways of how do you create a corporate structure that's supportive, and that has got to be an effort in force. It can't be something we impose. I mean, I've worked long in the tooth with police officers. I know how they get around things, and I know about perverse incentives. So you have to be really careful about setting targets as an implementation for some kind of change, because you're gonna get around it, frankly.
Yeah. So you're not setting targets, but you're putting in place ways of working that you think will make a difference, and that is and obviously flowing through APP, giving it some bite.
But the other thing is transparency, in terms of actually knowing what your workforce. I mean, when you find out that your workforce is more stressed than medics during COVID, I think you should be sitting up and doing something positive in terms of police well-being, officer well-being. You can't let that stuff happen. And what we were documenting were workplaces, police forces that were toxic. That were toxic to officers who were doing a good job or who were trying to really challenge the internal way of working. Were toxic to us. And so we met so many officers who totally understood what we were saying. We're and we're social scientists. We were able to actually enable a narrative about improvement that they felt they could do. And by the way, no laws have changed since we started working on Soteria. We're not asking for new laws. I certainly will ask for more money and funding, because if this part of the business is not funded properly, then you're always going to be squeezed. And I think it's up to us, the citizenry, to say, Well, actually, we want a police force that's competent,
Yeah.
to investigate something that we know in health and education and substance abuse, well-being, mental health issues, is a major contributor to harm in society. Sexual abuse is one of the main contributors to social harm.
Yeah.
In all the other sectors. So why can't we get better in policing? If we're the so-called thin blue line between the citizen and justice, then we just have to up our game.
And one of the main findings, this finding about that there's greater focus on investigating the victim than there is on understanding the suspect. I mean, taking a step back, that's just kind of mind-blowing, really, isn't it? When you think about it, how do you explain how we got into a position where that's the case?
Well, social myths die hard.
Yeah.
And also, so many victims are vulnerable, and so many victims, we all have some, we all have some ghosts in our past or things. And if you have somebody that's excavating your life, they're bound to find something that's going to do that. Plus, I'm afraid I don't think women are equal yet. So views of women are still not appropriate. Views of any victim of sexual violence presumes in the first place, because they're relationships that actually this is just miscommunication and not a crime. And so it's getting to understand how the lived experience of we know is such a wide scale. One in three people have been sexually abused in this country. What is going wrong? What is wrong? So it is about saying that policing is such an important place in challenging the abuse of women and of men, but it's so dominated by what happens to women that we've just got to take seriously what the lived experience tells us. And so when we began to do this work, we were basically, the lived experience of sexual violence was at the center of what we were doing. We brought in people who have done that kind of work as their academic expertise. And they were asking the Martian questions.
Right.
Well, if you really knew about sexual violence, why would you do that? Why would you talk to somebody like that? Or do you not understand that anything you could say with somebody who also may have mental health issues is that you may actually pitch people in a way that really damages them. So at the basic, what we're just asking is to do no more harm than the abuse has done.
Yeah.
And what we were finding, and what Katrin Hull's survey of victims shows, is that there was a lot more harm being done.
Yeah. Nikki's asked a question here. Do you feel that all police forces, however small, should have a dedicated RASO unit rather than some forces using general CID officers to investigate sexual crime?
Right. So we absolutely say that anyone who is investigating sexual crime must have specialist knowledge. How a force configures its units is up to them. Yeah. We found forces that said they had rape investigation units and nobody had ever received a CIDIP course. So having the illusion that you have competence by saying you have a rape unit, what I want to know is how many of those officers actually are accredited to do that work. How many of them have sat in on their and finished both their investigation courses and their CIDIP courses. I think people would be shocked at how few across the country. There is a small proportion. And again, if you take a look at what good looks like on the College Policing website, looking at the model, you will see that one of our performance metrics, improvement metrics, is to know how many officers were actually properly accredited to do the work that they're being expected to do, and how many they're supported to do that work. And I think, so it's not a rape unit that makes a difference, it's having the knowledge that makes a difference.
Yeah. We have a question from Rebecca, and sorry, Rebecca, I saw your question earlier and didn't get a chance to ask it. In relation to the comment on the disproportionate effect on women, what are your thoughts on how police forces record suspects' sex? Of the 32 forces that answered a Freedom of Information access requests, no force records sex registered at birth as standard in all circumstances.
Yeah, it just these are there are so many protected characteristics that are not monitored by the police. Yeah. So the answer is, what we have found was that there was so much missing demographic data. If we want to know that information, we have to be able to ask it, but you also have to be able to incorporate it into a standard way that all forces do that work. I know that there is a working group now looking at how to integrate information about protected characteristics in official records. So that's all I know. We are at the situation that we are in, and we are using information that we have. So I think that's that can only and should only get better as time goes on.
Yeah. And could you you talked a bit about learning and development, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this, separate to Soteria, but obviously informing what you did in Soteria. And what's your sort of take on where we are with police officer learning and development? You've obviously been pretty critical in relation to where we are in terms of sexual offending, but just sort of more generally, what's your take on where things stand? We've had PEQF brought in. We've had this sort of professionalization agenda sort of filtering through from the college and so on. PEQF arguably has been rowed back on a bit more latterly with recent changes. So yeah, I mean, where what's your sense of where things are and where we need to get to in terms of learning and development?
Yeah, so what we found, certainly working on Soteria, was the kind of academic and professional evidence base and frameworks and ways of thinking and ways of working were often removed from the kinds of courses that police officers get, even with PEQF. I know that some of that is based in universities, but I still think that we lack the balance between thinking about what does the evidence say and what do you do in practice. And that kind of translation, I think, is clunky, needs a lot of development. I also think we need to turn some things about policing on its head. And we need to start being far more radical in terms of the kind of traditional hermeneutically sealed, only police can train police in some matters. I think that I would feel far more comfortable if we almost had every course that police took was reviewed for what the outside scientific evidence says. And how can we make sure that it's aligned? To me, that is really important. So that kind of separation between the knowledge base that we found and what was going on, both in the learning development units within police services, because remember, one of the things that happens in this country, England and Wales, is that the college policing set standards and often the learning outcomes and sometimes in detail the courses, but they're delivered, often delivered in force. So it's that there were so many gaps between what we found is you can't just have a trainer, any trainer, reading a PowerPoint about
Yeah.
sexual offending. You
Yeah.
need to have the benefit of those good practitioners, the good investigators in the room to say, well, this is how you do this. This is how we translate, this aspiration into this outcome. And I find that learning and development was not a place where the best practitioners wanted to be. They
Yeah.
just they didn't want to be there. But we've got to find a way of inspiring those that are learning through the work of the best practitioners and the best science and knowledge base that we have. Because there are times that I have heard, this was when I was, so the example that the reason why I got into the learning and development sphere as well as I attended a session, police now won't, I've written about it, the first year of Police Now when I attended a session on burglary, and they spent a little bit of time talking about the law of burglary and what burglary might be and how, but they didn't use any of the academic knowledge about burglars. And we actually have quite a lot of knowledge about burglars as foragers and people who have routines, and these are ways that you can actually bring into an investigation. If you think about the way
Yeah.
burglars burgle, what do you do? But they spent an inordinate, like more than half of the time also taping a bag
Right.
because it was an evidence bag. You had to get your evidence bag right. So there was something about the way the the craft of tape trumped the whole knowledge base
Yeah.
of how to understand burglary. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And it also was even more of a light bulb moment because that's what I took into Soteria.
Yeah.
You really have got to transform the way we learn as new recruits, the way you learn about crime and criminality and offenders and people and
Yeah.
procedural justice and how to treat people well, how to interview. I mean, how to even talk to people, and that's not some for a lot of people. It's not natural. I mean, you need coaching is really really important.
Yeah. Fascinating. And we've got a question from Chris here who says uh, he's an academic he or she is an academic who has conducted research with police on sexual violence initiatives. Any advice on how to respond to challenges from criminology colleagues who speak from a defunding the police perspective and are very anti-engaging with the police to make a difference? What do you say to that sort of thing?
Yeah. So all I can say is when I've met that hostility my entire life, nobody could figure out how it is and why it is that I talk to police. I mean, I start off as and actually continue to work with lots of people who are radical feminists and activists. Um, I always find it curious in a democracy that we feel like we don't need a police service. I mean, spend a little time as you do, and you find that actually people use police. They're not thinking about defunding the police when they pick the phone up. So we do need I believe we need a police service. We need a good police service. And frankly, what I know about policing in this country is they're underfunded. They're not overfunded. There are some things that actually they do waste money on, and I won't talk about them now, but those of you in the audience that are police officers, you'll know where they are. And there was a lot of waste when I joined, certainly the Metropolitan Police, because senior officers had extraordinary amount of privileges. They had drivers, they had cars, in the Metropolitan Police, we had, we, I don't know if you remember the restaurant. I mean, even the wine bottles had a Met label on them. So there was a lot of money that was spent that probably could have been spent on something else. But I find the whole defund the police is I can't get my head around it because um, I what I'm interested in doing is making the police better. And therefore the funds that we give them are the appropriate funds because they're actually doing good work on our behalf. And when those who are angry at being the objects of police behavior, and there are many, those incidents happen day in and day out. There's no question about that. There are officers who should not be police officers. There are abusive officers. There are racist officers. There are homophobic, all that stuff that exists. However, many other officers I've worked with who I would actually trust my life with. So the next time you're in an emergency, try not calling the police. No, even it's to me, in a democracy, we need police, and therefore in a democracy we need good police. And that's what I do. So I kind of roll my eyes when people say, oh, let's defund the police. It's have no cooperation. Yeah, well, that's a choice, but it's not mine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, I quite agree. We've got probably just time for one more question. So this question is from Ruth, who says, I did that burglary training with police now, and I vividly remember the taping evidence bags. Is there something here about the inaccessibility of academic writing and criminology to the ordinary police practitioner? How can academics be encouraged to make their writing more accessible? What is the role of societies of evidence-based policing in this?
Totally. I'm with you. I agree. That's why we translated. So that's why we worked in tandem. I find multisyllabic total academic work really boring. I have a really hard time reading it myself. I think it's a mark of a really good social scientist and a good academic that they can talk plain English. And she says with an American accent. And I think that is a challenge to all academics. But the problem with academics and academic work is they themselves are judged by their academic publications and their prominence in the field. And often that prominence is by becoming an expert in a particular area and in writing in a style that is academic. So we just need to find a way of bringing them together and having a commitment to working differently together.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, Betsy, we haven't even covered all the questions I wanted to, but we've done.
I looked at the time and I said, how could that go so quickly?
But look, I mean, we've covered a huge terrain there. Thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm sure all the people watching will agree with that. So it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to spend time with you, Betsy, and it's really inspiring to hear about the work that's happened in Soteria, which, you know, after a very long career working hard on this stuff, to have to have achieved something which has had the cut through that this has is really incredibly impressive. So yeah, I mean, everybody is saying thank you so much. They really enjoyed the conversation. So so that's great. So thank you, Betsy, and we'll obviously put this on YouTube so people can also watch it again if you want to sort of pick up on things we said. And if you
scary.
Yeah, well, if you there might be sort of groupies out there who might want to watch it twice. So if you want to and if you had a question that we didn't get time to answer, do feel free to email it through to us. You'll have Nicole's details who helped organise the event, so I'm sure we can do that. But thank you very much, Betsy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We'll be having another one of these exchange. Again, we're doing them every month on a Friday. We'll be doing another one in the new year. We'll let you know about that. We'll make sure you get emailed about it, and we'll put it on our social media. But yeah, thanks very much, Betsy. Thanks, everyone, for making the time.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
That's bye from me.
Bye-bye. Thank you.